Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Grazie mille to those of you who are from Perugia for welcoming us. This is our first time at the festival, and we are very, very excited. It's been an overwhelming but incredibly stimulating week for us so far. Your city is absolutely beautiful. Everyone has been so warm and so welcoming and so forgiving of our very, very bad Italian.
I'm proud of your attempt just now. That was very impressive. Very impressive. You picked some things up.
I've been practicing. I've learned like 6 phrases. I'm Juleyka Lantigua. I am the moderator of this very distinguished panel for the day. I am an oldie but a goodie, I like to say, an OG. An OG journalist. My very first job in journalism included shipping literal blueprints of our pages of our magazine to the printer by FedEx overnight. That's how old I am. I learned how to talk on a rotary phone. That's how old I am. You guys can Google that. I've had the privilege of working at places like The Atlantic, at NPR, and 5 years ago I decided to branch out on my own because, like Gandhi said, I wanted to be the change I wanted to see in the world, and I have been incredibly fortunate to have worked with some of the most brilliant digital audio producers in the United States and around the world, including Lory Martinez, from whom you will hear today, at a company called LWC Studios, where we make original shows and we also make shows for our clients. Some shows that you might be interested in listening to include 70 Million, which is a narrative, investigative look at the criminal justice system in the United States. We're 40 episodes in on that show. It's been nominated for a Peabody. It won a couple of other things. We also did this really beautiful homage to Black American culture called Driving the Green Book, and that looks at the thriving, a rising middle class in the United States post the Great Migration and during Jim Crow. And so there's just a lot of stuff that tries to surface stories that deserve to be told but haven't been told properly. And so I really invite you to take advantage of that. And now I'm going to invite our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves, because this is all about self-determination as women in media. So we'll start with Laurie.
Hello. All right, so I am Lory Martinez. I'm a Colombian-American founder of Studio Ochenta. It is a multilingual podcast company based in Paris. I created the company as part of a desire to raise voices across cultures, because I myself am a daughter of immigrants. And one of the first shows that we did in the 3 languages that I speak, so English, French, and Spanish. It was called Mija, and it followed the story of a daughter of immigrants kind of coming to terms with her identity and following the journey of her family from Colombia to New York. And subsequent seasons we did in Chinese, Arabic, with other daughters of immigrants, and that ethos that was put forward with that show was awarded at the Webbies. And after that, we've kind of continued to put that kind of message in all of our programs, whether we work with clients, which include the UN, international organizations, and institutions, and as well as news organizations like Euronews. And on our original shows, which we do in now up to 27 languages. So I had started the company with the 3 languages that I spoke, and then as we grew, we've added them on to share even more stories and do that via translation, so that the most amount of people can, have their stories shared. And I think that's it. I hope I didn't miss anything.
That is not nearly it, but we'll get to more stuff later. And here is the very brilliant and very beautiful Erin.
Hello, I'm Errin Haines. I do what Juleyka tells me, but my paying job is that I'm editor-at-large at The 19th, which is a nonprofit independent newsroom that focuses on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. I am one of the 5 co-founders of The 19th, which we started in January of 2020, because we were frustrated with a lot of the narratives around American political journalism, which was frankly too white and too male, and so we wanted to change that, and so we started a newsroom that would help to change that conversation. In my capacity at The 19th, a lot of my focus is on the intersection of race, gender, and politics, and so I bring my lived experience as a Black woman from the American South. I'm a native of Atlanta, and was focused, even before I came to The 19th, a lot on Southern politics, Black women in politics and how Black women are exercising their power in our political system, whether that's as voters, organizers, donors, candidates, and elected officials. So I spent most of my seasoned career in journalism covering the intersection of race, politics, and culture with stints at the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Orlando Sentinel, and writing for a number of outlets. I also talk about politics, gender, and race on MSNBC, so do a little bit of television, which my 22-year-old journalism self would not have envisioned, but here we are. So yeah, I really do believe that covering women as a special interest group is not what should happen, since women are more than half the population and more than half the electorate. And so, we assert that our voices are the ones that should be seen and heard in our democracy, in our society, at least half the time, but definitely so much more than is currently the case in way too many newsrooms across my country. So, yeah, we'll get into some more of that later, but.
Yes. So here's the plan, because I'm driving the bus, but I want you to be happy passengers. I know it's a really cheesy metaphor, but it works. You get it. You're on the bus, we're driving. So we're going to talk about 3 things in our discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions from you, which is really why we're here.
Yes.
We want to make sure that you get what you'd like to have in terms of information, guidance, knowledge, resources from us as much as possible. And I want to encourage you to, right now, follow all 3 of us on Twitter. You can find us by our name, and you can hashtag, you can quote us, whatever you want. But more importantly, because the 3 of us are really good about sharing resources for young journalists and for people who want to be in the media. And so it's just a thing that you can do. It's kind of passive every once in a while, see what we're up to and see if we've, linked to anything that might be useful for you as young journalists. I also am going to encourage you to sign up for our weekly newsletter, which is called Podcasting Seriously. So you can go to podcastingseriously.com and sign up. It's completely free. It's in English. And there we pack it with resources and information for people who are working in media, but specifically working in audio. So absolutely encourage you to sign up for that free newsletter. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about a little bit about the theoretical framework for the work that all of us do. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about audience, which is the very important point that Erin just ended her comments on, which is that the audience is changing. So the way that we do news and how we do news has to change because of the audience. And then after that, we're going to talk about a little bit about the practical considerations of the work that we do, especially in a saturated, digital-first environment. So if I'm a good moderator, we'll get to all of that. And you can tell me after how I did. And then I'm also going to be interjecting with my own thoughts. I've also encouraged them to ask each other questions, to ask me questions, and back and forth. So it feels more like a conversation to you all watching. So I'm going to start with a really broad strokes question, which is, what informs the decision-making process about what news to cover or what stories to tell when you guys are working, you who are boss lady, and you basically decide what gets done, and then you who have influence over a newsroom where you can also dictate what other people are working on.
Yeah.
Where to begin? I guess I would start this answer with something that got me into podcasting, which was I had a career at NPR before I moved to France, and when I first got to Paris, the big thing that was happening was the Paris podcast scene was beginning to blow up, right? And the thing that was happening was that these women journalists had these amazing stories that their editors didn't think were interesting. And so they started making podcasts. And as the American in Paris that also happened to be a radio journalist, I started advising them on them. And it was very rewarding work. It felt like I was really helping them share their stories. And so when I continued to work doing that as a freelance producer, when I decided to start my company, I wanted to continue doing that. So whenever I choose projects, whether they're our originals or our client work, there's always this alignment with that vision of wanting to raise that voice or tell that story that hasn't been told before or tell it from a perspective that has been ignored or that hasn't even been heard in that language, because we only hear English American Anglo stories. And so this has been the driving force for all of the projects that we've done, and I feel very privileged to be able to choose interesting projects. For example, during the pandemic, we did a podcast called Ochenta Stories, where we collected 80 stories from around the world during the pandemic. And we started off by putting out an open call for pitches to journalists who didn't have work because they couldn't travel, especially audio journalists who are doing tape syncs. Started out with that idea of, I had tape syncs when I first started were a big thing to get into audio and podcast work. If you're a rookie, definitely try to get on a listserv that helps you be the person that goes and records a podcast or a radio show, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was like, okay, this could be a space for that. So journalists from around the world pitched us stuff. What was happening in, Mongolia during the pandemic? What was happening in Korea? What was happening in Japan? And we got these amazing stories, and that kind of thing is what we decide to do at Ochenta. Is if we have the space for it, if we have room for that, we can pivot our editorial line to do stories like that. And that's because we are able to work with clients who are international, and that funds our original work where we can experiment and where we can support other creators.
Amazing. So we have a very useful device at the 19th, and it is, if you've ever seen our logo, we have an asterisk at the end of our logo. Now, that asterisk is for two things. One, it is in recognition of the omission of the Black women who were left out of the 19th Amendment, for which our newsroom is named. The 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guaranteed access for some, but not all women, to have the right to vote in America. But there were Black women who were a part of that movement for voting rights in America who were left out in 1920, who had to fight for, basically twice as long. And it was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that they were able to have the right to vote. And so the asterisk is a reminder for us of those women, but it's also a reminder of who remains unseen and unheard in our democracy. And that really is kind of our North Star guiding editorial principle in everything that we do at the 19th. Yes, we are certainly focused on gender and politics, but even more than that, the marginalized folks in our society who have been left out. And so, our newsroom started with a focus on women, politics, and policy, but we've had to expand, frankly, to include kind of a larger conversation about gender, including the LGBTQ community, because we know that they have felt unseen and unheard in our democracy for far too long, and yet they are participating in and are being impacted by our democracy, right, in a very real way. And so that is a lot of what it's honestly a lot of what I've thought about throughout my career, although I would say I probably focused a lot more on race, the intersection of race in our society in the beginning, thinking about those kind of untold stories, unheard voices, bringing them into the conversation. But now being able to be a lot more thoughtful about what it means to be a woman of color, other marginalized people in this country who are not being seen and heard, and bringing them into the conversation is always what we are thinking about when we talk to people about issues. I mean, by the way, we feel like all issues are women's issues. I mean, you ask a woman and it's a woman's issue, right? It's not just about reproductive justice. It's not just about pay equity. Women care about everything, and women are voters. Whether and all different kinds of voters. So thinking about that, I think, really helps to guide, not just to guide me, but also to expand people's imagination about how we participate in this process.
Yeah, all issues are women's issues. So at LWC Studios, we focus on similar things, which is telling the stories from the margins, the stories that sort of get pushed out of the mainstream media reporting. But we try to go a step further, and we try to make sure that the storytellers themselves are also the people who are in the margins. So that's really important for us. So in every show that we've done, we make sure that the host, the producer, the editor, the engineer, the mixer, the tape syncers, as many people who are touching watching the podcast as possible are representative of whatever groups we're talking to. And so in some instances, it means finding people who are not readily available, right? So we have to make extra efforts to make sure that we find someone who is an editor who can come in to a story already with lived experience that will enrich the story and that will help the rest of us more fully understand the story. In other instances, it's language. Right? We need someone who is a native Tagalog speaker or a native, whatever language speaker, because again, language gives you a particular lens into a reality, especially if you're someone in any type of diaspora. Language is the first lens through which you experience both your personal culture and the culture of your new country. And so passing the mic, and people like to say this all the time, passing the mic is really important for us, so that we don't feel like we are simply extracting your story, but that we're giving you the tool, quite literally, the tool to tell your story how you want to tell the story. Now that often means working with folks who have 0 to 0 media experience. There really is no range. It's 0 to 0. And people who have never, for example, done a press interview. So we have an entire guide to how to approach an interview with people who are from groups who are historically marginalized. And in there, we talk about you have to explain the 3 levels of journalistic access, right? What does on the record mean? What does on background mean? What does off the record mean, right? And you have to make sure that that person understands why they are empowered to use those 3 levels of access, right? And then you also have to make sure that you give the person the right to say, I don't want to answer that question, right? And journalists don't ever do this, right? Because the last thing you want is to say to someone, you and I have equal power here. We're not trained to do that.
You're making such a good point here, Juleyka, and I wonder if you can just expand on how the approach that you're talking about, how does that help you earn trust as a journalist, right? Because we're talking a lot about the relationship that the media has with the public here at this conference, but really just kind of broadly in our industry. And how does that help you also create audience and create the kind of community that you've been able to establish that I really feel like is so remarkable?
Thank you. So trust, that's it. That's the first thing that you want when you are engaging with not only the subjects of these stories, but the audiences, right? Because this is the other thing. Folks in marginalized sections of our society are so used to being misrepresented that they come at everything that mentions them with absolute mistrust, right? And so the way to assuage those fears is to put as much of the power back in their hands. So our guide, for example, says, let them choose where to meet. First and foremost, where are you comfortable speaking to me? Is it indoors? Is it outdoors? Is it away from your home? Is it in your home? And then allow them to bring someone to the interview, right? Do you feel comfortable bringing your spouse? Do you feel comfortable bringing your sister? Do you feel comfortable bringing your best friend? Bring whomever you feel comfortable, but also understand that they now become part of the story, right? So we explain that very clearly. Then we go through the exercise of explaining the 3 levels of access, make sure that they understand that. We say directly to them, at any point you can choose not to answer a question, and we will not pursue that question. 100% of the time when they initially say, I don't want to answer that question, they come back and tell us even more than what we expected to find out. Right, because we've gone through all of the steps.
The transparency is established.
To reassure them, right? And then there are other times where someone might have agreed to an interview and then they change their mind, right? So we give them time and space. And then we slowly come back to them and try to say to them, okay, can we talk only about this part of the story? Because knowing this part of your story can help us to illuminate this other point. And so if someone decides that it's too personal, they might get in trouble with their boss, whatever that might be, we find other ways. And anonymity, we always offer anonymity if the person asks. Now, that is something that we don't offer readily because obviously anonymity dilutes your storytelling. But if it's going to protect someone, sometimes we suggest it. Like, during the course of reporting 40 episodes for 70 million, we have come across people who have had really life-changing experiences within the criminal justice system who would be in danger if someone was able to, link them to that particular story. And we have literally said, we have to change your name because we cannot run the risk that you're going to be endangered in any particular way. But I wanna go back to the both of you, because I know that both of you do something really, really intentional in your storytelling, which is that, and I'm not gonna give them away because I've been listening to her for years, reading her for years, but I know that there are elements in each of your storytelling techniques that are always present. So I want you to talk about what are these elements that you look for when you are crafting and pitching stories from your particular lens and for the audiences that you're trying to build.
I can jump on that just to add also to the thing that we use to gain trust from our listeners. And it has a lot to do with who are you hearing, who is telling the story, and do we have the right to tell this story if we are not from XYZ community, et cetera, et cetera. And as someone who is American, working in Europe, but also coming from my Colombian background, it's something that I've always been very careful about pitching or working on any project without somebody from that community on the team, like automatically. We're very fortunate at Ochenta. We have a lot of people who are multilingual on our team, and it really is helpful for us to do any kind of reporting in other countries when somebody on the team is a native speaker of that language. And it's an automatic thing that gains trust with the guests. We worked on a project with Euronews recently. It was called Cry Like a Boy. It was exploring toxic masculinity across the African continent. And we went to different countries. So Burundi was one of the countries that we went to. And for example, for each of the episodes, we always had a local reporter. And that person was guiding this narrative of that episode. And of course, we worked together as a team, a very international team, for each episode, but that voice was the primary voice that was talking to all of the guests who were discussing their issues with toxic masculinity and how they were overcoming it with incredible things that they're doing. I definitely recommend checking out that podcast. It's available in English, French, and within the episodes, the other thing that we made sure we had was the local language. So whatever country we were covering, we also heard that person's voice in the show. Obviously, it was dubbed for the listeners in English, but we still had parts of that voice. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't completely replaced. And that's something that we wanted to make sure was going to be the case, and that we do systematically for every one of our shows.
I think, really being open to what the reporting journey is going to bring. Even as, I'm somebody who focuses a lot on Black women and their experiences, understanding that women are not a monolith, understanding that Black people are not a monolith, being open to where that's going to take me, but also understanding that, me coming to them as a Black woman, there may be, a foundation there that may be perceived as a shared experience, but then which is helpful, but then we go from there. And I'm trying to doorway. Exactly, yeah. Exactly. And so I'll give you an example of reporting that I did in the pandemic, actually. So we started the 19th, like I said, in January of 2020. I started covering, the 2020 presidential election. So for the first 3 months of the election, it was, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. But then campaign trail goes away. Joe Biden's in the basement, and for all intents and purposes, I have no campaign to cover. So I'm like, well, what am I going to do now? I was on the ground in Philadelphia, which is where I'm based, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and began to realize very quickly that women were going to be the main people impacted by and responding to the pandemic. And so with that being the case, Philadelphia was already a very unequal city in the United States, and I had this idea to cover women one issue at a time in the pandemic in the poorest big city in America. And so did a project. I thought I was going to do it, for a few weeks.
Okay, that is the definition of intersectionality, by the way, if you missed that. Women in the pandemic in the largest and poorest city in the United States.
So I thought, maybe a few weeks I'll write these stories. We'll be back on the campaign trail. Pandemic will be over. It'll be just fine, right? Like, sure. I could do these, do these stories real quick. No, I ended up doing 3 months of stories on, they were called, a series called Portraits of the Pandemic, these women, we're talking about women that were from my community, but also not from my community. So, a black woman who was a pastor who had to suddenly do church virtually, or a teacher who had, was trying to stay connected to her students and take care of her students while she was also taking care of her own family and trying to educate them in a virtual environment. But then, an Asian American woman who was running a Laotian community center, who was trying to keep her community informed about the pandemic, but also connected, because that community center was really a resource and a hub for people in that community that they couldn't have when we had to social distance and we couldn't be together. There were so many different experiences that some I had, there was some common ground, but there were also a lot of things that were not common ground for me, and we had to find ways to tell those stories in a way that was going to resonate, not just with other women, other people in Philadelphia, but with our readers across the country that might have been having similar experiences, or could somehow find a way in based on the experiences of these people that I was highlighting. And so that was really, really helpful to me as a reminder that, yes, I'm a woman, all of these people that I'm interviewing are women, but our experiences couldn't have been more different, even as we had some similarities. That was really an eye-opening reporting experience for me, but very rewarding.
So obviously read everything she writes, but Erin's reporting is for me, one of the best examples of what I call asset storytelling. So I'm a big believer in writing and storytelling that is built upon the assets of the subject that you're talking about. Much of journalism, especially in, clickbait world, comes from deficit writing, deficit storytelling, where you try to highlight the thing that is missing, the thing that is negative, the thing that is toxic, because that's clickbait, right? So whenever I am evaluating a pitch or a story, even a source, I think about, will this lead to asset storytelling or deficit storytelling? Now, let me really be super clear that does not mean we don't deal with difficulties and complexities and downright ugliness in the storytelling. No, that's not what it means at all. This is not about sanitizing the story. This is about making sure that when I bring the perspective of the writer, the producer, the editor, the sound designer, the fact checker, we're all working from the vantage point of we're trying to build from the assets that are embedded in the storytelling.
I love what you're saying, Juleyka, and I feel like such a big reason for, I think a big reason for that being my approach, for that being everybody's approach up here, is because of the lens that we bring to this work. We know women are doers, people of color are doers, people from the immigrant community are doers, right? So why not focus on that as a vehicle for storytelling, to show people what it is that our community is actually doing, right? And the people that we know are in these communities are actually doing, as opposed to focusing on trauma or what's wrong with us or what we're not getting right or how we are at a disadvantage. Yes, those are stories too. Yes, that is news too. But, approaching stories in the way that you're talking about helps to bring balance, helps to bring a humanity, a dignity, and a more holistic approach to talking about these communities that I think is something that needs to be more of a habit in our industry, let's just say.
I have a question for you guys, because I deal with this all the time. People always ask why we do things in other languages. Well, who cares? Who's going to listen to that? If it's not, no. Let me complete the thought.
Nice.
Some people have, this thought that why would an Anglophone want to listen to an Italian story translated? That hyper local focus, why would it matter to somebody that's not from that country, not from that community? And so that questioning is something that is a challenge, but that we face all the time. And my answer to it, at least through our content, has been, yes, it matters. And yes, that perspective is interesting to someone who is not from that community. Of course it is. And our work is giving other people access to it and kind of closing those barriers that naturally separate people.
Yes.
And for us, it's language. for you guys, it's not hearing those voices in their community. You could, you're not from Philly, you've never heard about that small town. I don't know anything about that town, and you've given me perspective about that space, about the people living there. And the rest of the country would listen to it. It's not about America, it's about Philly. And the same thing, this story is Italian, but it's about Europe also. It's about what's happening across the world. The topic that we did was the pandemic, and that was something that was accessible to everyone. Yes. And it did matter to hear those stories. I cared about sharing a story about an Italian woman who was fighting with her husband about doing the dishes. And guess what? It was our most popular story at the time. And the translation of that into English gave people access to it around the world. And so we have to, I mean, that's my answer to it is it's worth it to tell your story. And, when it goes online, when it goes into people's ears, it's already global. It's already there. Yes. And don't be frustrated by it. I mean, at first I was very frustrated by this because I had to explain it all the time. Like, why 27 languages? Well, sir, access. And
so
yeah.
Your answer is access. My answer is math. I love analytics. I recite them ad nauseum. You give me a good analytics report for a podcast and an espresso, and you can just forget about me. So my answer to that question would be, well, let's take a look, shall we, at how fast the Italian podcast market is growing. If you look, in the last 5 years, literally, that's my answer. Because
how many espressos have you had today?
Why you know people? No, because first of all, math is really the only truly universal language that we have. Everybody knows this. It's really the only universal language that we have, math, period. Not the Romance languages, not Mandarin, not anything else, right? And so when you can say to someone, listen, I'm not making a personal choice here. I am going where the audience is. I am going where the need is, and simply making something that will fulfill that need. They tend to back down because then they can attack you personally. This is not a personal choice that you're making. You're saying there's a market, there are certain demands in the market, and I am producing something that is going to meet the market. Now, in my case, to stay relevant, we try to stay ahead of the market. So we started Latina to Latina 4 years ago, before we knew that 16 million Latinos were listening to podcasts. And then 2 years after we started Latina to Latina, we became one of the founding sponsors of the first ever study on Latino podcast listeners. So my theory was, there are Latino listening to podcasts. I don't know how many, I don't know where they are, but I'm gonna make something for them. And then 2 years later, we get to quantify with analytics this theory that I had about this audience, right? And so sometimes you have to know what you know. And I know this because I've been writing about Latinos and Blacks in the US for 20 years. So there are things that I know because I've been talking to them for the last 20 years. And so with that information, I say, you know what? The census is also with me because in 2015, for the first time ever, the incoming class of public schools in kindergarten across the United States was majority minority. Because in 2025, the first ever graduating class of high schools in the United States will be majority minority. Because in 2043, 1 in 3 women in the United States will be a Latina, right? That's math. That's not me deciding that we're cute, right? And that I'm gonna make something for us. That's me going where the market is going to be, right? And so I think that that's really powerful. And we know that women are not encouraged to go into STEM and math and those hard subjects. But ladies, statistics, sexy as hell, let me tell you.
Can I just say one thing about that report? So Juleyka went and did this report. And in the year that followed, I got contacted by so many people saying, oh, I heard Latinos are like listening to podcasts. Like, do you make like, I heard from this report that I didn't know about. And then and it was Juleyka who opened the doors by actually knowing what we already know, right? And I can't tell you how many people cited that report to me. There's, it's like, it's crazy. It's like they're really into it now. I just never knew Spanish was so important as a language.
Yeah. Okay, so the other thing that
It's frustrating, guys.
How many cappuccinos have you had?
No, but I mean, like, as a Latina in the U.S., it's like, as a journalist, even when I was coming up in public radio, there were only 2 shows, Radio Ambulante and Latino USA. Yep. And when I was in public radio, like, I was the only Latina in the office. And it was not a perspective that was interesting. I actually thought that there was no use for me to speak Spanish in the U.S. doing radio. I didn't think that it was useful for me at that time. That's incredible. This is many years ago. But it drove me to make my own content where I could hear my voice and my kind of story. And, and that's also why Mija was one of the first shows we did, because it was telling that perspective of an immigrant girl who was frustrated by the fact that, content doesn't reflect the value of her voice, the value of her language, the value of her bilingual experience. And here we are in Europe, where, let me tell you how many people are bilingual in Europe. Everybody. At least so I came to the right place for... And yeah.
All right, so let's move a little bit into audience, and I want to start by sharing a little bit of a wormhole that I went into like 2.5 years ago, because sometimes when people make me doubt myself and the stuff that I know, I just go down these like Google searches, and I'm like, wait, there's got to be some information about this. So one day, some dude was really adamant about my theory about the rising audiences that my company addresses. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I gave him all the statistics, I gave him all of the theory, I showed him all of the things that we'd been making as proof, right? And then he hit me. And I said to him, do you play sports? And he's like, yeah, I play golf, and I play a little bit of baseball, blah, 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 blah. And I said, do you know how many baseball players or baseball fans there are, or how many people play golf in the United States? And he's like, no. So I said, let's look it up. So I went to Google. Only 60 million people in the United States play golf, but there are 50 million Latinos in the United States. And only about 7 million people play amateur tennis in the United States, but there are 50 million Latinos in the United States. And I just kept going down this list. And then I said, so how come y'all are allowed to have Major League Baseball, 37 channels for baseball, 27 channels for basketball, 57 channels for golf? There's only 16 million of you. And then I went back to my house and went down that wormhole because it really gave me perspective. That I was like, if people who play golf, and enjoy the sport are allowed to have magazines, radio shows, multiple cable channels.
But because he was not the audience, he decided that there was no audience.
Ding, 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 ding.
No.
You win. So the 19th obviously had to have some serious conversations about audience and has to continue having those conversations. So what does it look like when you guys are talking about audience?
Well, I mean, honestly, math is definitely part of the equation for us because, again, half the population, half of the electorate. So we knew that the audience was absolutely there. But also, access was really important for us. So the 19th, you mentioned your newsletter. The 19th has a free newsletter every single day. We also have a free weekly newsletter and a free newsletter for our members. You can sign up, again, for free, going to 19th19thnews.org. You will get the newsletter every single day. Our news is also all free to consume and free to republish. So we don't care if you are reading a 19th news story and don't know that it's a 19th story. If you read it, whether you read it in USA Today or you read it in an ethnic media publication, wherever you read it, we believe that, we're not just going to cover these marginalized communities, but they also need to be able to actually read the stories that we are writing about them. This is not an extractive process. That's not the point of this, right? So yeah, I mean, we definitely knew just kind of given who is in the world and who is participating in this democracy, that there was an audience for what we were doing, and that they were frustrated, frankly, again, that they were not being seen and heard, or that they were only being treated as a special interest group, as opposed to people who are very active in participating in society and in democracy. But also, beyond just the written journalism, the stories that we are producing, are events helping to create community to build that audience, right? Because somebody is not necessarily coming into the 19th because they read a story that I wrote or one of my colleagues wrote, but they may see that we're having an event about an issue, whether that's climate, whether that's healthcare, whether that's caregiving, something that they specifically care about, that brings them into the conversation, that brings them into the 19th community in a way that they may not have otherwise found us. Going to where they are, going to where they live, and reaching them across various platforms that we know that our audiences are using is also something that's very important for us to grow. But also, I think just at the end of the day, respecting them as a community and an audience, and trying to do that with the journalism, but just really in everything that we do as a brand.
Yeah. So actually, I want to pick up on that point, because traditional media has the belief that if you build it, they will come. Right? Let's just make something and the audience will somehow magically find it. No. That is no longer true. It's, you have to build it, you have to find your audience, you have to bring it to them, you have to tell them about it, and then you have to remind them about it. This is the media ecosystem that we're in. And somebody over here has done an unbelievable job on a global scale of building it and bringing it to the audience where they are. So I want you to talk about what your strategy is as you get ready to launch a show in a different language about bringing your shows to that audience.
Okay, so we have an approach which is the automatic approach, which should be the automatic approach, but which is not the case, especially for people who are thinking of translating their content. They just translate it. They don't talk to people locally about how people listen in that country, do they even know what podcasts are where you're trying to translate this to? Like, why are you even translating it? These questions, a lot of the time, aren't even asked when things are translated. But when Ochenta translates something, and we go into a new market, we go and we do the show with a local partner. Mm-hmm. So what we did for the Chinese podcast that we did, it was the second season of Miha, which is the flagship show that I was mentioning before. And in this season, we had talked about, it was basically an 8-episode journey of this Chinese family to France. And it was told by a Franco-Chinese creator. She wrote the scripts, she put it together. And we wanted to tell it also in Chinese because obviously, the story is about that. And we want that community also to access this because it's about them. And it makes sense. That was the questioning we had around it. Is it worth it to do it in this language? Yes, 1,000%. Also, for people who are around the world who are part of the Chinese diaspora, yes. So the calculation was made. We're going to do it. And we're going to experiment because we don't know how podcasting is for this specific genre, which was a fiction podcast. We didn't know if Chinese people were interested in that kind of content. And so we worked with a local partner in Shanghai, and we found a local platform so that it could be available within mainland China, because that's not possible unless you work with somebody in China.
Again,
because
access,
the access that we got, that no other company that's tried to do things in China for audio has had that success, because if you make something in Chinese, it's not made in China, it's not going to arrive behind the firewall. It's blocked. So we immediately had that. The immediate web access was the big thing. And then also understanding what other podcasts could be of interest there. So with our local partner, we identified other podcasts with similar messages and promoted across those shows. And the content itself was adapted and developed even more for the Chinese audience. So it was an adaptation. It wasn't just a translation. It was changing the story so that a mainland Chinese person who may have family members who have left, but who is living in China now, would respect and understand that perspective and not feel like it was a European telling us a story. And that was a huge deal, because whenever we make anything in the other language, it's always to say we're not the European or we're not the American telling the story. No, we're the Italian telling the Italians the story. We're the Chinese person telling the Chinese person the story. And that thought process helped us get to number one in China, on all podcasts.
Wow.
And it was crazy success. And it all started with that questioning of audience. We knew we couldn't just translate the show and like put it out into the internet. We had to think about it with strategy. And so that thought process should be behind everything that you do, is the audience. And I want to finish with the Spanish thing, because on the other side of it, there's always that conversation like, oh, are people interested in bilingual content? Do they speak English and Spanish at the same time? Oh my goodness.
Often to the same people.
What? And you know, I've seen it even here in Europe. Like, people start sentences in Danish and end it in English. This is natural for people. Yeah, and knowing that actually helped us with the bilingual content that we do, because it's an understanding of how people actually hear things in your life. Even if you do not speak Spanish in your Spanish-speaking household, you've heard it and you understand it. So that questioning doesn't happen anymore because we know our audience.
Yes, and that creates authenticity for what you're doing. Absolutely. Amazing.
All right, so following Lori's example, let's talk to the locals. It's your turn to ask us questions or share some insight with us that we might not be privy to. We've got about 14 minutes to be exact. So shoot us, and you can ask us in multiple language. One of us will understand it.
Or Google Translate.
Yeah, somebody will translate.
Anybody got a question?
She has a question, but she's looking around because she doesn't want to go first. Yes, you.
No, I don't have a question. I just have, congratulations. Very, very interesting. I work for an international organization, and I'm a press officer there.
Okay.
We work a lot with communities all around the world, and I'm based in Italy. So I don't have a question. I'm really trying to listen and to understand how to better engage and better, communicate with them, and not on behalf of them. So
Yes.
not putting myself at the front, but really give a platform for those communities, for those people who we, as a trade union, we represent, but not, without putting myself, as the Western Italian
Yeah.
person at the forefront of it, but giving them actually the opportunity to speak and the capacity to speak and raise their voice.
Okay, I have to say what you said into the mic. So for those of you who are not in the room, she works for an international organization as a media communications officer, and she's here because she wants to learn how to communicate more effectively and to include marginalized communities in the work without coming off as having a Western lens to what is being told, which is something that requires work. So, so I thank you for that.
I don't know if including is the right word, because I don't like the idea that I am the one that includes the people.
But you control the platform, right? So you have a responsibility, right? So she's countered that she doesn't want to feel like she's including other people, but if you control the platform, you are in fact including other people. So part of the thought leadership that has to happen around storytelling is that we have to think about power, and we have to think about leadership as the constant redistribution of power, right? So when you are the person holding the recording kit, the mic, the phone, when you are the person writing the blog, you have power. So part of your thought leadership must include the redistribution of that power, right? It does not mean you don't put your byline on it. It does not mean you sort of say, mea culpa, I'm only just a white person writing about this. That's not what it means. I say that because I see that all the time. I see people sort of excusing or making a preface statement to say that, hey, if I got it wrong, it's because I'm only just...
Disclaimer.
Yeah, it's a disclaimer. We don't want a disclaimer.
No, but what I really appreciate about what you're saying is that you are starting with an intentionality about how you want to approach this work, and that is absolutely the right place to be starting from. I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. I think you also mentioned at the beginning, like raising, want to raise the voice of women. Everybody's talking about raising the voices of somebody, and you're having amazing results. But in the traditional media work, I don't know if there's something like this, they look at, okay, how much share of the market I do get. So so how can you raise your share of the market? Because, I mean, do I need to come here to hear about all this 3 plus 25 amazing talent initiatives to raise different voices? Because it doesn't get to the main, always to the mainstream. I don't want to be negative.
Do you want me to repeat it and then you answer it?
To get those stories embedded in
Okay. So let me repeat the question for our listening audience. So great question. So the question here is, if you are trying to think about being more inclusive and reaching out to different audiences, but you're working in a more traditional space, how do you do that? And I definitely have an answer for that, but I want to hear from you guys first.
The first thing is to not see it as, I mean, I guess maybe it's because diversity is a buzzword and inclusion is a buzzword, and there are many initiatives around the world to fix this problem of representation. Yes, that's the big problem that all media organizations are doing. The solutions have been handed and down in a list. It's always, hire a diverse team, leadership should be diverse, having multiple identities across the team, and yet there's still this problem. And I think the reason that there's still this problem is it goes back to that audience thing. For me, I think we think that no one wants to hear these stories, and even if we have somebody on our team, and a lot of the time in traditional organizations, this happens, is even if we have somebody on our team who is, completely identifying with whatever the story pitch is or whatever, there's always gonna be that questioning of whether it's worth it to do that even, or, is there an audience for it? We've never done it before. And I think the solution there is to always be willing to experiment. So yesterday there was a panel on audience growth, and they were talking about the questioning of media organizations trying to do this and why it's so scary to try to do it, because you don't have any metrics yet to say, okay, we're gonna do a Black vertical or we're gonna do a Latino vertical, because we don't know if that's gonna be interesting to our audience. We don't know if it's worth it to do a Spanish or another version of our podcast. And I'll give the best example of this, which is the Washington Post podcast, which they've recently turned into El Washington Post for Spanish audiences. And the way that it was presented to the board in this traditional media organization, one of the oldest in the US, was that we know that there's an audience for this, and we know that they consume content in Spanish from other outlets, and they also consume content from us in English. So we're gonna experiment, and they pitched it as an experiment. They had, I think it was 2 or 3 years, as part of the pitch of the project, to see if it works. And whether it does or it doesn't is gonna be a thing that they're gonna learn from. And organizations that are trying to do this diversity and inclusion thing really need to be willing to do that. Because otherwise we're never gonna learn from our mistakes, and we're never gonna get those stats. We're never gonna get those reports like what Juleyka did with just the Latino listener report. We're never gonna get that unless a foundation or a media organization sponsors the research, sponsors the project that tells you that it's worth it to do this project, worth it to talk to this audience. So that's kind of the roundabout answer, but yeah, it's really about that experimentation. And I would encourage news organizations to be willing to make those mistakes, because you have the capacity to make those mistakes. Tiny little organizations like ours, we're small startups, we're small women-owned businesses. We don't have the capacity to experiment to the same level as, Deutsche Welle, So they have to kind of unblock this kind of frustration by having board members be like, okay, we can experiment, we can make these labs, let's do it. Yeah. Because in a couple years, if they don't have any numbers, they're gonna keep seeing stagnation, and growth is gonna keep stagnating. You're still gonna be talking to the same people, and you're gonna be missing out on audiences, and then you're gonna have specialized organizations like ours who are gonna be talking to those marginalized voices, and you're gonna want a piece of that pie, which you could have had before. So, yeah.
I think it really is, showing people proof of concept, right? For us at the 19th, I did a little experiment the first year that we were in existence. Until somebody noticed, I quoted only women in every story that I wrote. Because why not? There's a woman expert, woman voter, woman candidate. Occasionally I had to start quoting Joe Biden. He was the Democratic nominee. He comes into the story, but seriously,
he has a role.
Why not quote women political scientists? Why not quote women as voters who are interested in the economy or education or healthcare? If you do that, I mean, we quote stories, we have stories that quote all men and nobody says anything, nobody notices, right? But if you do that enough, you know, that can turn on the light bulb. People pay attention, right? That can turn on the light bulb for people in mainstream legacy organizations to say, you know what, why aren't we incorporating women into stories about issues, right? Like without making it a story about women, right? You don't have to do that, or yes, somebody might be LGBTQ, but also they are a college student, or they are somebody who cares about what's happening with the Supreme Court in the United States. And so you bring their voice in to normalize their participation and their inclusion as a member of democracy or society. And so I think, you know, for us at the 19th, just it really was proof of concept about who gets to participate in our democracy, who gets to be seen and heard, and how. And the more that we normalize women, marginalized folks, people of color, LGBTQ folks, the disabled community, whoever, the more that we are including them, the more that really helps our electorate's imagination and our society's imagination about really getting away from othering folks in our communities and in our democracy.
So my answer is way more specific. And I know a beautiful lady in the back. We have 4 minutes. I am on it. I am a timely bus driver. This person is the entire audience of everything that we make at my company. This is an avatar. Well, this is a picture of what I think she looks like. This is an avatar that I found 5 years ago after a lot of searching. Her name, and this is all statistically true, because I did it, again, me and math, right? I did a huge statistical dive when I was starting the company to create an avatar, a persona for my ideal audience. One person. Her name is Kenya. She's Afro-Latina. She's the first generation firstborn daughter with 2 younger siblings. Her parents are Afro-Peruvian, Afro-Panamanian, Afro-Honduran. And she's the first one to go to college. She's the first one to get a managerial job. She started as our audience for Latina to Latina at age 26. She's now about to turn 30. She's engaged, thinking about getting married and having her family.
Wow, Kenya.
Yeah, no, Kenya is on the fast track. Kenya is a digital native, and she's hyper-connected. She's the person that her friends turn to for recommendations about music, about fashion. She is politically aware. She votes every election. And she's also the person who gets into arguments with her ignorant aunts and uncles about stuff. And, no, this is Kenya.
Add Kenya to my group chat.
Yes!
Kenya sounds very interesting.
See?
I want to meet Kenya.
So when I launched the company, I decided that the 2 guiding questions for everything that we make at the company were going to be, will Kenya listen? Will Kenya share it? And to this day, whenever we consider a client or whenever we consider a new idea for a show, I ask those 2 questions first. Will Kenya listen, and will Kenya share it? And if you look at all the shows that we've made, or on the original side and on the client side, those are shows that either she will listen to herself or she will share with someone in her life, right? And that simple sort of like outlook has made thousands of decisions non-decisions. Wow. Because if it's not relevant to Kenya, it's not relevant to us as people who are trying to overserve her, right? Because my big dream for my little company is that we're gonna become the go-to place for not just Kenya, but her husband and her future kids as we grow with her, right? And so I am constantly updating what I know about Kenya based on surveys, based on the census, based on demographic information about young women in the United States, because I need to keep up with her, right? Because she is the primary objective for why we do what we do.
Keeping up with Kenya. By the way, tell Kenya to subscribe to my newsletter. Okay,
I will.
That'd be great. Great.
Each of you gets 20 seconds to say your parting words, to promote something, to invite people to connect with you. Go.
Oh my gosh, okay. You can follow me and my company at Ochenta Podcasts with an S. Ochenta spelled the Spanish way, not the Italian way, guys. Chenta. And we make podcasts in lots of languages, and if you want to experiment with us or learn about our experimental projects with news organizations and institutions, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and or via our social media. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Look at that, the bell is ringing. eMarvelous on Twitter, on Instagram, 19thnews.org is our site. Like I said, there you can sign up for our free newsletter. We would love to stay connected with you all. We have a virtual summit that we are also going to be doing this summer, where we will be talking about issues of gender and sports. We're celebrating the anniversary of Title IX. So we would love to stay in conversation with all of you. We are connected to you now, and you are part of the 19th family. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
You're a good bus driver.